Welcome to the third part of Lesson 2. We're still looking at Lesson 2, the origin of projects and project selection. But now we're going to look into or deeper into the other financial parameters and the remaining topics I promised to cover in this class. First of all, in this video, we have the last financial parameter, which is in fact the internal rate of return, or the IRR. And the IRR is a discount rate, and it's the discount rate for which the net present value is equal to 0. So we look at all the discounted cash flows, minus the initial investment, it has to be 0, and we take the same set of values that we had before. Now, the thing here is a little bit more difficult to calculate. We cannot find an explicit function saying this is the IRR on the left-hand side, and we have a formula to calculate it. In order to calculate the internal rate of return, we can use a formula in Excel. It has been explained in the other videos. Now, we can also calculate it by hand, and we do it by estimations. And we'll have a look at that, how it works, because basically what we're going to do is we are going to create a table with different discount rates and calculate the net present value. And we will see that there is something special in the table. Now, the internal rate of return is the yield of the investment. Now, it's like you put your money on a bank account and you have a certain percentage. Well, the internal rate of return will give you that percentage, that yield that the project will create. And we have to see if that yield is in fact acceptable, yes or no. Let's have a look at an example. I did put everything in a table. You can do it quite easily in Excel. And what I see, 0%, well, all the values are, or let's say, are not discounted. We find, let's say, a net present value of 550,000. And let's see how we calculate this for 7%. So we make the formula in Excel, we copy paste, it goes very quickly. And for the 7%, we find the different cash flows divided by the discount rates of discount or the coefficients. So 75k divided by 1.07, 150k by 1.07 to the square, up to the last one, 175,000 or 175k divided by 1.07 to the power 6, which gives us 814,300. We can calculate the net present value, so we subtract the initial investment, which is 500,000, and we find 314,300. And we do that for all the values. And we continue this table until we find a special element. And when you look at it, between 22 and 23, we see that the value goes from plus to minus. Now, when it goes between plus and minus, it means that we pass through 0 somewhere, and we have to find the percentage where the net present value is equal to 0. Now, we can do that by a calculation, and you see the calculation here. When you have the 22% and the 23%, I calculate the average. The average here is 22.5%. It's still positive, 5,289. So we still have the internal rate between 22.5 and 23. Since it's positive, we calculate the average again. We find 22.750. It's still positive. So now we know that the internal rate is between 22.75 and 23. We calculate the average again, which is 22.875%, which gives an NPV of 110. We now know that the internal rate of return is between 22.875 and 23. We calculate again a new estimate, and we find that for that new estimate, the NPV is negative. So now we know that the internal rate of return is somewhere between 22.875 and 22.938. We calculate again the average. We find a negative net present value. So basically here we see that the internal rate of return is between 22.875 and 22.906, which gives us 22.891 as an average. It's again a negative value, so now we know that the net present value is between 22.875 and 22.891. And when we calculate the average again, we find 22.883. Now we will see later that this is in fact the net present value if we use the formula in Excel, or when we continue the calculations. Now we can continue, the more iterations we do, the more decimals we have, but typically 2 or 3 decimals for the percentage is more than enough. The rest we don't have to calculate. So when we see that the value stabilizes at 22.883, then we can stop. Now let's have a look at the graph, because the graph is quite interesting to see. Here you see the net present value as the function of the discount rate, and we have the different percentages, and we see that somewhere between 22 and 23 we go through 0. So basically that's the result that we have, and we have to find out this element here. We have to find this value, and when we look better at the graph at the 0, we see here this is the point where the net present value is equal to 0, and the discount rate that corresponds with it is 22.8830%. When I did the calculation in Excel, it gave me this value. So basically that's the element that we want to have. These are the parameters that we need. Now let's have a look at some other elements that are important in the selection of projects. The first element I want to talk about is the business case. The business case captures why a task, in our case a project, should be initiated. And we look at financial and risk elements, financial parameters and risk. Those are the 2 elements that I basically want to understand when I'm looking at a business case. Now, it's very important to know that even when you have a good business case, a business case with a low or acceptable level of risk, with good financial parameters, it doesn't mean that that business case will be selected. There may be a lot of elements, a lot of proposals, a lot of business cases that we consider, and in the company we have to make a selection. And that's a very complicated process, because you have to optimize not only the project, but also the programs and the portfolio. You want to have the best result for all the elements together. And that's very important to understand. Now, when we look at the business case, there are some elements that are part of it. Some of you may already have made a business case, understand what a business case is about. First of all, it's very important to have a preface saying what you're talking about, a table of content, and always an executive summary. An executive summary is very interesting because as a manager, you don't always have the time to read everything. So the executive summary will provide you with information about the content and the conclusions. And basically, when a manager wants to know more about the business case, they can look deeper into it, they can evaluate and read the things that are important for them. Now, we have to look at an introduction, of course. We look at the business drivers, the scope and the finance of the task or project we are considering. We have analysis to do, including assumptions, a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. There are financial evaluations to be done, like a PBT, return on investment, NPV, ERR. There may be other elements that you will consider. You may look into the benefits and also the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is basically what you lose because you select this opportunity and not another one. And the last element of the business case relates to the conclusions. There are recommendations and next steps. Now, everybody can have different formats of a business case, and you may have a template that you have to follow in your company, so you can use those and you can adjust it to the needs, of course, for the type of work that you are considering or the industry you are working in. Another element is a statement of work. It's typically from an agreement between different parties, like a client and a supplier. The statement of work describes the work that must be completed in order to comply with the contract. There are financial agreements, there are timing parameters, there are quality standards, there are other relevant elements that may vary from industry to industry. So you have to evaluate what is important in your case, what is agreed with the customer, how will you realize it, and so on. Now, the element here is that you have contract negotiations. As a supplier, you provide an offer to the customer, and of course, in that offer, you have to include your profit. Basically, you have to understand the cost model of the services that you're providing. Now, when you're providing a typical service, you have cost factors, how to create the work, how to do certain activities. And when you evaluate your offer, you make a calculation on how much do you think the project will cost you. You add a profit, and with that profit, you have a margin of negotiation. Now, when we were looking, for example, in AT&T, we had a statement of work, we had a contract to implement a wide area network, and based on that information, we typically had a list of activities to do. We have to implement those sites, and every element was in fact decomposed for us as a number of activities to complete. Each activity had an estimated cost. So when we started working on the project, we know what was offered to the customer, we have our cost model, and we can see that the implementation goes well or not. We can evaluate how good are we doing our job, and it may also lead to the fact that we may have to change some elements. Now, it's very important to estimate the cost in a proper way, because if your cost estimation is wrong, it will, of course, have an important impact on your profitability. Another element we can find when we're talking about projects is what we call a feasibility study. And a feasibility study is a report that examines a project in its 5 frames. We call them telos. It considers the 4 P's, the risk and the vulnerabilities of the project. But let's look at those elements, what telos means, what are the 4 P's, what we mean with risks, and what is the POV. Telos refer to technical, economic, legal, operation, and schedule. Here we're going to evaluate, is it technically possible? Is it economical to do it? Is it legal? Can we operate it? And can we do it within the schedule? Very important parameters to evaluate when you're doing the feasibility study. The 4 P's refer to plan, processes, people, and power. Now you see the different elements that we have to review. Very important elements. Certainly people and power are very important when we are looking at a feasibility study. The risks refer to external events that have an impact on the project, and they relate to the plan, the processes, the people, and the power, external elements. And the vulnerabilities, or the points of vulnerability, that's why we have POVs, relate in fact to the internal vulnerabilities of the project. Those are the elements that we have where we can find the project. But in order to finish this lesson, I want to talk about the return on investment policy. Now, we have to define an ROI policy, and the ROI policy is different from the parameter return on investment. The return on investment policy is a combination of financial parameters that we have to evaluate in order to select a project, yes or no. So based on the definition of the ROI policy, we have a set of parameters and specific conditions. A simple return on investment policy that I always promote is based on the payback time, the net present value, and the internal rate of return. These are good parameters to evaluate the financial performance of the project, but in your company, you may have other parameters. There is a modified return on investment, there is the economic value add, there are other parameters that you can evaluate to assess, in fact, or that you can assess to evaluate a project. Another element, when we look at it in detail, the PBT depends on the industry, and you can define payback time, a maximum payback time, and when your project exceeds the payback time, we will exclude the project. The net present value, well, this is very clear. It has to be larger than 0 because it's about the profit. The NPV is the expected profit of your project. And the last parameter, the internal rate of return, is the yield that your project will generate. And like I said before, the yield or the ERR has to be higher than the WACC or the RRR. Now, why are those financial parameters so important? First of all, we have to understand, does our project has a financial sense to do it? Now, we want to make a profit. We will have to follow our standards, so we have to see that all the parameters have been met. Now, once the budget has been set and we approve the project, we go into planning. And at the end of the planning step, we have a new, more detailed estimate of the project. And here we're going to do a re-evaluation. We have to see if our project still complies with the financial parameters that we defined before. Now, that's a very important element to do because we want to be sure that after a thorough evaluation of the project, that we still can have a project with the PBT as we defined before, that we have a profit and that the yield is high enough. And of course, during the project execution, we also have to evaluate how the project is going. We will look at schedule and cost variations. We may have delays, may have cost overruns, and we have to continuously evaluate the viability of the project. Another important element are, in fact, the changes. When we have to select changes, we talk about estimations. We will talk in lesson 3 about decision making. Well, during a project, we may have changes. We may see that some things have to be adjusted to the needs of the customer. And of course, we have to see what is the effect of these changes on the finances of the project. And like I said, we have to verify if the project is still compliant with the business case. Well, it's possible that the project can be cancelled after planning because we found out that the project is more expensive, that we don't have the financial performance that we expected, that we discovered some things we didn't know before. And also during execution, we may find out that at a certain moment that we have changes, that some changes are good, or they make the project let's say not profitable anymore, or we can see because of delays and overspending that our project is not efficient, and we may decide to cancel the project. So these were the things for lesson 2. You can review this whenever you want. You will also have this in the presentation in the Zoom session that we will have. And basically, we are ready, or you will be ready to pass the quiz, to finish the discussion board. And when those 2 elements are finished, you are ready to go to lesson 3. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you and bye-bye.